to Unmoored, America adrift in historical forgetfulness and finding our way back. In this show, we dig into the societal upheavals in recent U.S. history that have left so many feeling lost, angry, or hopeless, and explore how our nation became so unmoored. At the heart of this upheaval is a major debate over how to build a society where everyone can thrive. Our host is history professor and theologian Carl Kreisman. Joining Carl is Matthew Porter, a writer, director, and creative executive.
Matthew.
Hey, man.
How are you, my friend?
I am well, Carl. How are you?
I am good. Episode 4.
Yeah, right? These are clicking along.
Yeah, we're moving deeper. We're moving deeper into the
It's happening.
Argument.
It's happening. I know what we're going to talk about today, and I'm very excited. But if we can, before we dive in, whenever I'm in a place like a mall or something or other, I always appreciate that map that says you are here.
Yes.
So I can orient myself. So before we dive back in, since we're now starting episode number 4, give us a quick overview of macro version. What are we doing with the podcast? And then would you just kind of tee up what we talked about last time as a prelude to today's episode?
Sure. So I think a short version is we're investigating what happens when a people forgets their history. And why does knowing one's national history matter? And in particular, we've argued why it matters for the style of government that we set up. You can know your history, but it may not necessarily matter. But we've said, hey, there's some clues in our national history. And, of course, all this predicated back to episode 1 from a sense of saying, well, there's some problems in our society. There's just no denying it. And there's a lot of them, and they don't look good. And so what can we learn from our history, or is there something, I think there is, but that could be a question, is there something in our history that can guide us so that we can then hopefully find a flourishing, or to use the metaphor we've been talking about, a safe harbor, not necessarily having to think about going backwards. If people are like, I don't want to go back, and maybe there's some reasons not to go back, particularly if they think in terms of culture or of religion or those kinds of things that they might at least initially feel are onerous or not positive. So then we want to go forward. But to go forward well, we need to know kind of what was before. If I've argued that we've had a negative, the data is negative to our trajectory and we're unmoored, then going the way we're going is clearly the wrong answer. And if they're negative, then once they were not negative. So then, what was true when they were not negative? What have we lost that we had before? Right. And so that's kind of the general sense of what we're trying to focus on. We're going to try to dig in. Today we're going to dig into some really ancient history, and then our next episode is going to stay in some ancient history for most people because there's some clues there for us.
Beautiful. Beautiful.
So last episode, in the middle of that, then I think somebody could say, well, if there's a problem, like why is there a problem, or maybe who or what group? And there's probably multiple ways to slice this. There's maybe multiple ways to talk about like what has contributed to a lack of flourishing, for our society. But for me, I see this as something that has occurred in our recent history. And I've talked a lot, I've mentioned more than once, a kind of 60 years or 80 years, kind of there's been this time of passage. And there's actually a much larger historical pattern that could be applied here. Probably needs to be its own bonus episode, so we're not going to touch on it, but I've written on it. And so you can see over this, say, 60, maybe 80 years, we've kind of gone down here. You say, well, who's in the middle of this tension? And ultimately, short version, my contention is there's a group of citizens who almost all are Christians, but certainly are conservative Christians, who feel like something has happened to society that they believe has produced peril or negative change, and they see themselves trying to save things. And it's perhaps not fully fair to say all of them are Christian nationalists, but in a broader sense, I think you can point that out and say they seem to be asking for the solution to reside in something connected to their faith. And they would, most of them, claim something about our history that they would say sustains this. Now, we're going to look at that in about 2 or 3 episodes, and quite honestly, I'm going to take it apart. Opposed to them is this other group that has long championed or believed in some promises that kind of are inherent or even openly stated in the Enlightenment that suggest the human's just going to go on a trajectory of getting better. We're going to get rid of dogma and old religion and old myths. And once we do, we'll be better. Things will be great. And actually, for the 2 or 3 centuries that's happened, particularly the 20th century, the evidence is abundantly clear. That's false. Nietzsche touches into this. Kierkegaard touches into this. These ideas of existentialism, of nihilism, are not just a negative outcome. They are the actually predicted outcome if you follow kind of the Enlightenment in that directory. Well, these two people, we're going to think of them as a character like in a play. So the Christian, the conservative Christian, and say the Enlightenment person or the progressive person are in tension as they've both strove against one another. And I'd say from the 80s, say the Christian has been more strident in pushing, we must preserve and return. And the progressive has said, wait a minute, I think that's going to be a negative for me or for things I value. So this tension, and that's kind of where we left it, kind of looking at those two groups.
Yeah. Love it. And we move forward from there.
Yeah, because I think it's so we're going to focus mostly today on this episode on that first group, say the conservative Christian. I think, so I am a Christian. I am still a reverend, a pastor. I have seminary degrees, have spent 30 years in doing Christian ministry, 20 years leading a church, other times doing other aspects of Christian ministry. And so I have a lot of friends who are Christians. I have a lot of people that I've interfaced with, both as their direct minister as well as other people who just know me as a pastor in a pastoral way. And I would say that what I hear consistently from my friends, particularly those who are more conservative Christians, that they feel like something has been done to them. And I would suggest to them that there's a way of viewing this, that we could say they're suddenly realizing something that's probably been true for at least 30 years, that they are no longer the majority culture. And so they're pushing back against this. They're like, I don't like this. And they're kind of wanting to kind of investigate that and maybe find a way to reverse it. For me, this really became something that came to my mind around 2008, 2010. And I began thinking about, well, what happens when the people of God are in Babylon, which we'll talk about historically what that is. And from that time to today, it's actually been something that has been used as a metaphor of explanation. And for many people, and they go down a variety of different directions as to what they think the outcome of that means. And I would suggest that there's something for the collective group of Christians as well as for the individual. And today, what I really want to focus on is kind of that individual sense, because ultimately, as I said previously already, it's my contention that the situation is not that something has been done to you as the Christian or to us as the Christian, but that we've actually somehow failed to uphold our end of what it means to be called someone who is following God. And I think that the history shows us a time when that was true also. And so when you look at that, I think there's lessons for us to kind of get there. You've got this sense of that we want to try to save the culture, save the country, but I think that there's lessons that would suggest that our focus needs to be, as I said before, more spiritual on the interior of each individual, not kind of collective. So we're going to look at these Old Testament documents. If you have a Bible, they're in the Old Testament, but I really want to stress for you, we're thinking about these as historical documents. I've said this in other settings, but it's actually not correct to think of the Bible as a book. Right. It's actually a library of 66 historical documents from roughly the 1st century AD back to roughly, say, 1000 BC. So it's a nice collection. If you ever want to read some ancient documents, you can read those. And, and you're reading ancient Aramaic, ancient Hebrew, early 1st century, the common language of the Greek people at those times. So does that kind of help set up where we're going to go?
I think we've set the table, man.
All right.
Let's dig in.
So we need these ancient documents for us because of who we're talking about. So we're not going back to these because, quote unquote, they are the Bible, and ergo that makes them more special than other writings or more useful for us. But when we talk about conservative Christians, and again, I'm hoping our audience is a mixed bag of a variety of different people. So I want to explain something that some people might think, well, everybody knows that, but I don't know if that's true or not. What Christians purport to believe is that there was a human who represented God and even more audaciously said he was God, a man named Jesus. He was a real historical figure. He lived in Palestine around modern-day Jerusalem, modern-day Israel. And so he was a Jewish person who believed he was fulfilling some ancient ideas from 500, 600, 700, 800 years before. Mm-hmm. And Christians say, hey, we believe that. We agree with that. So when I'm saying that, what I mean is Christians have a connection to the writings and the people and the history of Jesus's own people, the Jewish people. And that's, you can get that, if you have a Bible, because the second half, the shorter half, are the writings about Jesus and kind of his crew. Mm-hmm. But the early half, the Christians have said, hey, we want that. We want to include that also. People often more accurately will call that the Hebrew scriptures, the Hebrew writings. And there may be some others that are in that mix, but these are writings that are important for the people of Jewish faith who do not agree with who Jesus said he was and all that kind of stuff.
Right.
So Christians have said, hey, this is important for us, and we need this information. And so when we look at their history, we find something useful for us. Okay, I'm going to pause there for a second and just say, does that foundation of why we're even looking at the Bible make sense to you?
Yeah, and I like what you pointed out, that everybody can kind of untense right now. And this is not a sermon. This is not the context of what we're exploring right now. Good as a sermon is. Everybody's invited, and we're looking at a historical document and historical context through the lens of politics and social developments.
Yeah, we're examining the history.
Everybody just get comfortable. We're not gonna lock the doors and ask you to sign something.
Last time you said you thought some people might get upset. I wonder if this time people might get upset too, because for my Christian friends, strap in, because we need to learn some hard lessons. That, again, if you are a Christian and you believe God gave us the Bible or has allowed it to be preserved, so groovy, then you need to hear what he would say to us today through it. If you're not a Christian, I think it's going to be a really useful kind of setting of the place. And in the future episodes, when we do talk about how Christianity was critical to some of the early colonial foundings, I think this will be helpful for you for some of the things that they thought about. Mm-hmm. I will also note, and probably point this out more than once as we're going along, that I want you to listen to how many times a criticism was people had forgotten their history. Mm. The idea of historical forgetfulness, the thing kind of that's at the core of what I'm arguing here. We're in the peril that we're in because we've lost our way. We've lost our way because we've forgotten the things that had made it better previously. Not perfect. We're never again saying the United States was perfect. We're not in a triumphalist kind of position of how cool we are. I'm not even saying we'd be great if we got back to the 1950s. I'm not making that argument at all. We'll see that later. But so these writings consistently have a messaging of you've forgotten your history to these people. Okay, so you ready?
Yeah, man.
Okay, so here we go. So the Jewish people are a people who kind of emerge into the story. There's a longer history, say pre-1500 BC, that involves some individuals or involves a single family. Eventually, this family grows large enough that it becomes a large tribe of 12 brothers or 12 family groupings, right? And there's a longer backstory, which we're not going to get into. They emerge into modern-day Palestine, modern-day the land of Jerusalem, Israel, all that kind of thing. At roughly 1050 BC, they form into a kingdom. So once they were in this land, they were like 12 tribes. Think of, say, the Native Americans or the tribal peoples who live in a generally understood geographic constraint. Remember we said last time or previous time about what a civic entity is. So these were not 12 independent civic entities, but they still were families, and they were related in those areas, right? So the 12 distinctive, we would say, states. But they finally congealed into a kingdom. That kingdom was led by a certain family. Like a lot of places, they fight a civil war. The kingdom shifts out of that civil war. There's a lot of tension to it. Some of you may have heard of a guy named David. So David's one of these key central figures of the story. These people, kind of like we talk about George Washington, Abraham Lincoln. This guy, David's one of those dudes. He was someone who united the kingdom, really laid out the setting. His son, Solomon, took the mantle from him. By the way, when David's the king, there's a second civil war, which he kind of navigates his way through, which shows things aren't perfect there. And eventually Solomon constructs a temple in Jerusalem, which becomes really kind of important. All right. Then in 930 BC, this nation splits again. This time there's not a civil war. There's a threat of a civil war, but they don't have the civil war. And they just split into two groups. So there's a group in the north who bears the name Israel. There's a group in the south where Jerusalem is located, and they bear the name of one of the tribes, a place called Judah. And all this is important because who is this people in their own understanding? Well, they are, quote unquote, God's people. And by their own understanding, they're God's people, not because they're special, but they're God's people because he wants to do something through them to kind of better the world. In other words, if you kind of take the story as they give it to us, God's position is, I have a plan for the world, and I'm going to show you, and I'm going to show you through this group. But with that comes some expectations he sets out, some things he wants to see. I kind of talk about this as kind of God's upside-down world, and what I mean by that is when you look at human history, the normative things humans do, God's kind of on the opposite end of that. Which is kind of troubling for us because if we're normal humans, we kind of want to do things our way. So he's got to help us learn how to do that. And so he was saying, hey, I've got some ways for this group of people to learn these things. And then through them, everybody else understands. All right? Good?
Yeah.
They don't do those things.
Oh, plot twist. Did not see that coming.
They blow it. And so really from early on in their story, there's another group of their tribes, their people, who they give the name prophets to. Now, don't lose that in thinking about future or fortune tellers. There's some of that. But just think of them as truth tellers about what God thinks.
Let me guess, they were so popular.
They were not at all.
They didn't.
Nobody liked these people. And what they consistently said, and it depends on where you start. There's some famous ones and there's some less famous ones. You got about 500 years-ish of them wagging their finger, not at the non-Christians or the non-God people, at the God people.
God's people.
Saying, yo, y'all are not doing the right thing. All right?
Yeah.
So this has been something I've been very interested in for a long time. And so for over the past couple of years, I really said, I want to dig into this. Because again, if I'm a Christian and I feel in the year 2024 that I'm in the minority culture, and I wonder, has somebody done, it's Hollywood's fault, it's those lefties, it's communism, et cetera, et cetera. Yeah. Well, is there something I can learn from my own faith's journey's history? That's kind of where this comes from. So you start looking, you say, okay, what happened that the prophets were pointing out? And spoiler alert, at the end, the people don't fix anything. They get in trouble, and God warns them through these prophets, I'm going to discipline you, like a parent disciplines his child. And that's a pretty rough discipline, and you and I can think it's over the top or not correct. But he basically says, I'm going to use another nation to kind of bring the spanking down. And he'll do that first with the nation of Assyria, not modern-day Syria, Assyria, around a city called Nineveh, to deal with the northern group, the group called Israel. And then later, because you think the southern group would learn their lesson, they don't. We're going to use another different nation called Babylon, and we're going to use them to bring the spanking to the southern group, where the city of Jerusalem actually is, where God's temple supposedly is. And this is all said ahead of time. Like, God's going to do this unless you guys make these changes. They don't make these changes. So, in other words, where they end up is they end up no longer the majority culture living in a certain geographical domain that they could say is our land, where we are the majority culture. I would stop there and note for everybody, if you went back in Doc Brown's DeLorean and landed somewhere in, say, 900 BC, you would find not 100% of the people living there were Jewish or God's people. So there were other minority cultures. They just were a very small percentage. This group of people go from being God's people to finding themselves scattered or in exile in the minority culture. So they're far away. And this is what I said earlier about being in Babylon. Babylon is the larger, more consistently mentioned biblical picture of how God dealt with his people. But the short version is, I want you to kind of lock in on, you have a moment where you have God's people who once were the majority culture, suddenly finding themselves the minority culture. And by the way, like us today, a lot of Christians, conservative Christians today, there are people going, why this happened? Why this happened? Why this happened? And there were some people who wanted to use kind of force, control, take over to fix the problem. In other words, the problem isn't us. The problem is somebody else. But God's own voice to them, again, by their own records of these prophets, is like, yeah, that's not the story. So when you look at the prophets, they lay out an actually very short list of things that the people failed to do that God asked them to do. And so here's just a real short list, right? So the number one thing that's mentioned, if you read through all the prophets that are in the Hebrew scriptures, in the historical records, they didn't worship God. They worshiped other things. They put their attention and their focus on other things. That's a fancy word for that called idolatry, which throws people today. But I can have idolatry in, say, sports, or in shopping at Amazon, or in my children, or even maybe my success at work. So it's something I put all my focus into. And God's saying for his people, you should put all your focus into me. That's the very first thing. The second thing he talks about is that the leaders fail to follow God's ways, and then by extension mislead everybody else. So don't think of that as our political leaders. Think of that as like our religious leaders in modern times, right? And then the third thing is that the people generally refuse to do what God wants, particularly in relationship to other people. Now, there's about 5 or 6 other things, including injustice, or kind of they pursue luxury. If you remember, I've said, what's our number one issue?
Comfort.
Yeah. So you get this situation where what they were dealing with roughly around 500-600 BC was this situation where they had failed to do the things that God had told them to do. And again, I want to stress repeatedly, they were told in the warnings, go back to your history, go back to your history, go back to your history. And they didn't. All right, so I want to pause there for a second because that's a lot of history and a lot of info.
It is, but when you set it up like that, all of a sudden it doesn't feel like a recap of history. All of a sudden all those things sound, oh, wait, that sounds really familiar.
Yeah.
We're all cousins historically, and all of a sudden it's not distant cousins. You're like, we do that. I've seen that. Okay. All right.
Yeah.
It just gets really real.
It does. And so what I want to do is I want to show you in brief 2 writings from 2 of the more well-known prophets and point out how these are applicable for our own day for someone who claims to be a God follower. So this is the point again. If I'm a God follower, then there are things I should be doing. And to use the example we just said, if the natural flow, or at least our country today, is to be addicted to excess, ease, and luxury, and to pursue that, right? So then I'm never satisfied. I want to have more. And I've said, and to say it's true, suggest it's true, that that's not healthy for us as a society. And that's evident within the Christians themselves. You'd say, is there a group of people for whom moderation is what is prescribed? And turns out there is this group, right? So this group can say, wait, we need to hear that we have replaced our focus of God into a focus for something else. And that's precisely what this other group, who also connected to the same God, the Christian God, the Jewish God, they're really the same being in the structure of both religions. And so, how did they fail that? So I want us to look at these two documents. Is that okay?
Yeah, let's do it.
All right. So one is by a guy named Isaiah. And again, you can read these prophets, and there's about 15 or 16 of them in the Bible. And you can read them, and if you read them, you'll see this consistency. So I just picked these 2 because they're kind of famous. So Isaiah starts talking about 150 years before the whole fall. So in this one scripture, so it happens to be in chapter 5. So would you read the Bible passage starts there in 5:11, and then I'm going to turn it into a modern take for modern Christian believers.
All right, Isaiah 5:11. What sorrow for those who get up early in the morning looking for a drink of alcohol and spend long evenings drinking wine to make themselves flaming drunk. They furnish wine and lovely music at their grand parties, lyre and harp, tambourine and flute, but they never think about the Lord or notice what he is doing.
Modern. You spend your time in frivolity, getting up early in the morning not to commune with God, but to look for a drink of alcohol, or to waste time on TV, to engage in social media, spending all day wastefully. You have food and drink, often in your worship. You have lovely big parties with hip current music, but you never think about the Lord and the things he is doing, the things and people he cares about.
Isaiah 5:18. What sorrow for those who drag their sins behind them with ropes made of lies, who drag wickedness behind them like a cart. They even mock God and say, hurry up and do something. We want to see what you could do. Let the Holy One of Israel carry out his plan, for we want to know what it is.
So modern. You drag your sins around in the open, tied to you by lies that you assume no one can see, but everyone sees. Your wickedness, both the open wickedness, like accepting modern-day slavery still existing in your town, or your private addictions to porn amongst your male church leaders, or the you think it's hidden wickedness, like a failure to pray, a failure to pursue justice, a failure to care for the widow or the orphan. That wickedness is proclaimed openly on your bumper stickers on your car. You mock God, acting pious, saying things like, even so, come quickly, Lord, or one day we'll all be in heaven, or hurry up, Lord, and do something.
Isaiah 5:22. What sorrow for those who are heroes at drinking wine and boast about all the alcohol they can hold. They take bribes to let the wicked go free, and they punish the innocent.
Here's a modern. Again, I want to say this is to God's people. This is not to somebody who says, I'm not a Christian. We're not talking to you. We're talking to the person who says they're God's person. Modern. You think you're heroes because you can claim the excess of gaming, ESPN, fantasy sports, Netflix binge watching, gambling, success at your video games, alcohol abuse, that you can live large, equal to anyone in the community. You can, quote, drink anyone, unquote, under the table with your excellence in fantasy sports or gaming or knowledge of the latest TV show, and yet you know nothing of God's word, his ways. You look the other way when political leaders from your side act wickedly because you think the other side is evil. It is you, Christian, who is evil for not protecting the innocent.
Starting to meddle, Pastor.
I mean, it's tough, but to go back to the data we said last time, right? We talked about a survey that was done. It was just one survey, but trust me, there are other surveys that you can find in this regard. That in this survey, adults were asked, did they know somebody who was a committed Christian? And so 84% of the young people said, yeah, I know somebody like that. And of that group, only 85%, only 15%. said that the person that they knew lived a different lifestyle. In other words, 85% of those who say, yeah, I know a Christian, said that person's life's no different than mine. And you think, well, in what way? Well, lying, angry language, things they post on social media, how they spend their money, pornography usage. These are all data points that are out there, which are a travesty and a tragedy. So that kind of points out this sense of what was in these ancient texts is actually very applicable for me today if I'm someone who claims his name. Now, when you think, well, is there a way to sum those things up? Well, I've tried to by saying, hey, here's some 3 problems, but the old prophets did the same thing. So now we're going to shift to a prophet named Jeremiah, right? So in Jeremiah, he writes in chapter 9, verse 23, let not the wise boast of their wisdom, or the strong boast of their strength, or the rich boast of their riches. So there's a scholar who called this the kind of the trifecta of human pursuits. And when it says boasting, that's the Hebrew word that's connected to the word hallelujah. Now, if you're not a Christian, you may go, I don't think I know that word, but it's maybe a word you may have heard. But obviously, if you're somebody's religious, you've heard this word hallelujah. It's kind of a statement you make in kind of honor or cheering for God. Hallelujah, yay, right? So Jeremiah is saying, you're saying hallelujah for these 3 things here. What 3 things? Kind of a boasting in wisdom, wealth, or might. This trinity of unholy worship, to quote the scholar, that it's in. And this is now, by the way, this is something that tempts all humans throughout all of human history. There's a sense in which that we get tempted in this way. So again, if you say, well, God wanted something different, and then there's a longer, probably more religious conversation, faith-based conversation to have, which we're not going to get into. But God wanted something different for the human. And so he, again, using this group, this one group, Not because they're special, but they're not special. But he's going to use them uniquely to say to the rest of the world, hey, here's how you should live. And then when he looks at his own people, they're not living any differently. They're also in this pursuit. Now, fast forward to the time of Jesus. All right, so skip forward to the time of Jesus. Because we could say, someone who's listening could say, well, again, that's those Jewish people. That's not me. That's not us. That's not my church. That's not what I think. And I still want to argue that something's been done to us. But when you look at the New Testament, this concern about this unholy trinity, this trifecta of human boasting, is once again presented. Or to say it on the other side, Jesus consistently said, hey, I've got a way for us to live and exist. And it's actually quite different from what everybody else has said. And he presents this in a multitude of places. You get it in his Sermon on the Mount, but he kind of mentions it in a couple other places and different ways that he's describing life. One time he was famously asked by some religious scholars of the Jewish faith, well, what's the most important commandment or thing we should do? And he's like, hey, you need to honor God. So that's that idea of not having the idolatry.
Right.
But then he adds to it, he says, but the second is like the first. And he says, you should love your neighbor as yourself. So some people kind of bring this down, love God, love people. For what's a Christian should be about, love God, love people, that kind of a thing. But that kind of sums up, if you go back to the Old Testament, what were the prophets saying they were upset about? They would say, well, you weren't really loving God. You were loving these other things. You're pursuing these other things. And then when you look around at how you're treating each other, you're not really loving each other. You're not doing the thing that I want you to do that should set you apart. Instead, you're kind of just doing like the normal thing, which doesn't make God look good.
Yeah, blending into the background.
Right.
You should be standing out starkly.
And so you can go through some of the ancient writings. For instance, one of Jesus' dudes, a guy named John, he writes several different things, and one of them he writes to 7 different churches, and one of the churches is a place, Laodicea. And in there, he kind of nails out, once again, this trifecta, that they claim to be wealthy, they're kind of asserting a vision or wisdom, and they're kind of proud of their privilege, of their power. They have nice clothing, basically, and John takes them to task. Or the very famous follower of Jesus, a man named Paul, he writes to the city of Corinth. And in the city of Corinth, he says, hey, you know what? Humans trust in their wisdom, their wealth, and their power. Sort of the same thing we just heard Jeremiah say. So here, 600 years later, God's speaker is saying to people who claim to be God's people. And again, when you read these letters, so that guy, John, writing to the city, a church in the city of Laodicea, or Paul writing to Corinth, he's not writing to non-believers. He's talking only to the people who say, hey, I'm in. I want to be a Christian. Okay, groovy. Glad you're in. By the way, God has an expectation for how you will live. And in both cases, John and Paul, and then you can find it in the other writers of the New Testament, you're not really doing it. And here's what you need to do. It kind of lays out. And our point here is to kind of say, hey, look, how you live is important. In fact, so Paul writes another letter to a city called in Colossae, right? So in this place, he says he's concerned about how they're choosing to live, and he basically says you need to leave that, you need to not do that. And once again, he lists this very clear list of things, including idolatry, living unrighteously, greed, and again, taking negative actions against others. So being angry, having a slanderous voice, tone, kind of negative tone. I mean, so he's kind of pointing these things out. And when you read these writers, I'll also note that they go back and point their audience to their history. They're like, hey, you should go back and review your history. We've been on this road before. There's a way God wants us to live, and we believe he's given us the ability to do so through his own power and efforts. But you have to participate. It's not just magic. You actually have to take some focus yourself and kind of dive in there. And it's not something that the non-believing person should be responsible for.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. However many hundreds of years later, you're like, oh, mankind should have evolved pretty far by then. You're like, did they though? Did they? Maybe not.
Right.
Maybe we still have that same gravitational pull towards the same things.
And I hope I haven't lost anybody. The reason that I wanted to focus on this for a while was to say, again, if I am a committed Christian and I believe that there are things wrong with our society, then by looking at the historical documents of this other group, a group, by the way, that I connect with, I kind of think I'm in alignment with them. I look at it and say, oh, wow, they also found a moment when they were the minority culture. They found themselves a place where they were exiles in their land. And if you know the whole story, after 70 years, something that actually was predicted by the prophets, they got to come back to Jerusalem and to that land. But once they were back, there's no point, actually until 1948, that the Jewish people were ever in control of their land. So while the actual historical empire of Babylon will fall to Persia to the Greeks, Alexander the Great, the Greeks, the internal division, and then ultimately to Rome, at no point are the Jewish people like back from exile. They may be back in Jerusalem, but they're not back from exile. And so you say, well, wow, these people were this minority. That's exactly how I feel. I feel like my values, I'm talking about Carl Kreisman, right? That sometimes I look around, my values are not honored, or not understood, or not agreed with, and it makes me sad. But then what I shouldn't do is go to a position of blaming some external force. Instead, I need to come back and say, well, hang on a second. Is it possible when I look at my own life, and then maybe at the churches and the other Christians around me, that the very same things that happened for the Jewish people back in the day happen again? That we have idolatry. That was kind of the whole point about looking at Isaiah. And when I read Isaiah 5, it just was really gripped with that can be modernized because that's us. People who claim to be Christians are more proud of their knowledge of fantasy sports, perhaps, or more proud of their new car, or the position of privilege that they've gained at work or in the HOA, than they are on the things that God's concerned about. Yeah. And I'm as guilty of that as other people. And that's a kind of challenge to my own standing. And who am I going to be concerned with? I should be concerned with me and my interior stance with God than concerned with some like politician or some other group doing something.
Yeah, and obviously it's feels more comfortable and natural to point our fingers to some external force that's the source of this change and these things being the way that it shouldn't be, versus being self-reflective and kind of taking stock. But even if you went along with those lines, let's just say, okay, let's go with that line of thinking. How much is it? Okay, it's 5% my stuff, and 95% Hollywood / fill in the blank. Fine. Do you have control over that 95%? Absolutely not. We don't. There's a book, I think you might have recommended it to me, Critical Conversations.
Yeah.
It's the idea of like, look, wherever the problem is, even if it's a small percentage falls into your lap, well, that's the percentage, 5%, whatever it is, that you have some say over.
Yeah.
So let's forget about how much, whatever, and maybe focus on, well, I have some measure of control over my choices and my history, whether it's 100% or 2. Let's spend some time there.
Yeah, absolutely. And the good news, if you're a Christian, is that God, or at least the historical writings that tell us about God, have not left us bereft of knowledge. If I say, okay, I get it, I've been idolatrous, we wouldn't use that word, most of us, about our home or about our shopping or about my collection of shoes or whatever your thing is. If you put your devotion in other places, or if you have, either through direct action or inaction, have allowed for the suffering of others, well, I could say, okay, I probably shouldn't do that, but I don't really know what to do. Well, the good news is, in these same writings, we get very clear direction as to things that we can do. So, for instance, in Micah is one of these prophets. He says, God speaking, I've told you, human, what is good. Now, again, human doesn't mean everybody on the planet. I probably would think this is good for everybody on the planet. But again, we're not saying somebody who's not a believer in God needs to do this stuff. The only people we need to be worried about are those who claim God. I'm going to stress this multiple times because it's easy to hear some of these verses and then for the Christian to go, yeah, thinking about their neighbor, you need to do better. God's not asking you about that.
Get off that train, man.
God's asking you about you.
Yeah.
So here in Micah, I want you to read Zechariah. And Micah says this, I have told you, human, what is good, and this is what is required of you. Do what is right. He means doing justice. Love mercy, and walk humbly with your God.
Zechariah 7:9. This is what the Lord of Heaven's army says. Judge fairly, true justice, and show mercy and kindness to one another. Do not oppress widows, orphans, foreigners, or the poor. And do not scheme against one another.
And I just want to point out for everybody, if you do read through the prophets, as well as the New Testament, particularly the prophets, when you hear me say that the people were not doing well with others, God is actually very narrowly specific here about widows, orphans, foreigners, and poor people. He
Powerless.
nails that again and
Yeah.
again and again.
Very important in,
Yeah.
in the broad scope of things.
And then when you go back and think of both the Jewish people at the time of their getting chastised and my contention of our nation, when you look at Christian people, is that we've become addicted to luxury and ease. And who doesn't notice today that there seems to be a real economic division between, say, an upper 25% and a lower 75%. Some would say more stark division than that, or at least just the buying power of the person who has an hourly job. Well, that's the poor. And so that's who you should be concerned. We're not talking about just the homeless person or the destitute person, though we would talk about them as well. The orphan, the widow. I mean, there's so many roads I could go down. I don't want to get sidetracked here, but I just want to point out that that wasn't something weird to Zechariah. And by the way, Zechariah is one of the exile prophets. In other words, after they got back in Jerusalem, they still didn't live right. They still get hammered by, you guys have forgotten your history, and now we're talking about your recent history. I mean, come on, people. This was like we were just in, 80 years ago, we were just in exile. I'm not 80 years old, but I know well what was happening in the country in 1900. Now, some of that's because I teach history, but I mean, also my parents were alive. I mean, I know that whole story.
Yeah.
So it was not far away history that we're talking about. We're talking about pretty recent history. And so he's going, how could y'all forget this? And yet that's what they were doing, the failure. So here's another one. Hosea says this, I, God, want you to show love and mercy. Do not merely do religious actions. That's a whole other thing that he does, which I won't kind of get into. But God's not impressed by activities you do that you claim to be of religious intent when you aren't doing the other things he's clearly said, like, again, Micah, I've told you clearly what I want you to do. Or as you said in Zechariah, here's what God says. So read the last one from Isaiah.
All right, Isaiah 1:17. Do good, seek justice, help the oppressed, defend orphans, plead the rights of widows.
There it is again, right?
Pretty plain.
It is.
It's not obscure, religious, whatever.
It is. And if you stay back, so I read to you Jeremiah 9:23. If you read the next verse, Jeremiah 9:24, God kind of confronts that trifecta of the trinity of unholy boasting, right? By saying this, I am the Lord who demonstrates unfailing love and who brings justice and righteousness to the earth, that I can delight in these things. So there's this alternative triad, unfailing love, justice, righteousness. The guy Paul we talked about, like 700 years later, is writing again to that city in Corinth, and he mentions the same thing. He's like, look, you guys will often be boasting about this trifecta of things, of power, of privilege, of wisdom, of wealth. And what God has done is God's chosen the opposite of that. And he kind of wants us to live into that. Now, that's not me saying you have to pursue a vow of poverty and you can never have, a new pair of blue jeans, or you can't ever, watch sports on TV. I'm not saying that at all. In fact, if you really want me to nail it down, I think if you go to, there's a group of writings in this ancient collection of historical documents that's a bunch of poetry. And it's a thing, they're each called a psalm, and collectively it's the Psalms or the Psalter. Sometimes you'll hear people say it that way. So in the very first psalm, there's this magical, wonderful phrase. There's a first verse which kind of describes there's two ways of living, but the second verse says, the guy or the person who is eager for God will demonstrate this by having a delight in the Lord's ways. And so a simple way for a person listening, particularly if you're a Christian, can say to yourself, well, how am I in my standing with God? Like, well, in what do you delight? Where is your delight? Is your delight in God, in his ways? And just think about what you delight. I mean, things we all delight in, right? I happen to delight in sports. So I do watch sports and pay attention to sports and, go to sporting events. That's clearly something that I delight. I need to ask myself, is that personal delight for sports? When I think about time, money, energy, do I put more into that than I put into my supposed claim about pursuing God? And everybody listening, if you're a Christian, if you're a God follower, that's the question you need to ask yourself. And that's really what's being discussed here in the sense of kind of, I guess, an aversion. How is there a way to fix the society? I think for some of my Christian friends, they would say or maybe think in terms of collective action. And I think I would say this way, 1 million Christians who would choose to live out their faith quietly, doing the things we just read in those other passages from those historical documents about what those guys said God expects, would be better just quietly living their way to kind of buck the trend of the data point that I told earlier. So the people who know them go, oh, that girl, man, she's got something interesting going on because she's a committed Christian, and boy, you can see by how they live without any fanfare. That'd be better than if another 1 million Christians each donated $1 million to some political action committee, to some political candidate, or even to some nonprofit doing good in the society. And those things may have some use and some benefit in some regard. But if you're someone who believes that there is the God in heaven and that there is a way to live my life and that that's something that should maybe guide and direct what we do as a society, what happens in your interior is the most important thing that's kind of at stake here.
I just recently did a CPR training, and they said if you're administering CPR and there's other things that need to be done, if other people are around you, somebody needs to call 911, somebody needs to get chest paddles, all these kinds of things. You don't say, hey, somebody call 911. Hey, somebody, because you have a group of people, and the group of people goes, well, somebody will do it. You look somebody in the eye. It's so easy when something needs to be done for us as individuals to go, well, somebody's going to be doing that. Sure, certainly. We have to stop and go, hey, am I being asked to do this? If I'm being asked to do this, then it almost doesn't matter if anybody else is. Before I get worried about that, I need to say, am I answering the call?
Yeah. I know it's difficult if you are listening to this and you perceive yourself to be sad because the things you valued or you believed were important and you thought maybe were important to the culture at large are now devalued. You may watch something on TV that you think makes fun of your faith or your position, or you may see laws that are passed. And I know that can be difficult, but I think we're here. And I want to be careful not to say on purpose, but that we're here is when you look at the evidence, I think not a surprise. And I think that there's a way forward. And as I've said before, it's not in who we elect or not in even the laws that are passed, but how interior we choose to live. And that's a guiding path for us as living as a minority culture. And I think, and our next episode, what we're going to talk about is there was a moment when people who claimed this faith position with this historical guy, Jesus, they actually did that. But then there's another moment when it all changed. And for me, as a historian and as a Christian, went deeply wrong. And that wrong has kind of altered and tweaked things. And we want to see that position because it points out another moment when we could say these Christians or these people who believed they were God's people lived in minority culture. And there's lessons for us about how to live as minority culture. But there's also then warning if someone says, no, the answer is a version of Christian nationalism, a Christian takeover of the culture. And we're going to kind of dig into that next time.
This is a meal.
It's good talking with you, buddy.
You too, man.
All right, see you.
Thanks for joining us on Unmoored, America Adrift in Historical Forgetfulness and Finding Our Way Back. Be sure to follow or subscribe so you don't miss any episodes. If you have any questions or comments, drop an email to carl@carlkreisman.com. This episode was produced and edited by Carl Kreisman and recorded at the Winter Park Public Library. The Winter Park Library promotes the free and open exchange of ideas and does not attempt to control or take responsibility for any opinions that may be expressed in this podcast. Opinions expressed in this podcast do not constitute or imply an endorsement or reflection of the library's policies or beliefs. Our theme music was written and performed by Kyle Williams. A big thank you to everyone who supports the show. And if you'd like to help, visit carlkreisman.com/unmoored.